Hello and thanks for joining us for this episode of Into the Killing. If you know of any cold cases that were eventually solved that you want us to cover on Into the Killing, please visit our website, criminallylisted.com, then go to the Suggest a Case page. On that same page, you can also suggest cases for Criminally Listed and Paranormally Listed. For this episode, we're going back to November 1972. On November 1st, 1972, ABC aired the made-for-TV movie That Certain Summer, starring Hal Holbrook and Martin Sheen. In the film, Holbrook's character, Doug, and Sheen's character, Gary, are in a relationship. The film takes place over the summer when Doug's son from a previous marriage visits him for the summer. The movie is considered a landmark film for many reasons. It was the first gay-themed TV movie. It's also considered the first sympathetic depiction of gay people on American television. It had the first gay parent, and it was the first gay-themed movie to win an Emmy. Scott Jacoby, who plays Doug's son, Nick, won the Best Supporting Actor award. 2 million people tuned in to watch the movie. On November 12, 1972, the 4th season of Sesame Street was launched on PBS. In the episode, they introduced the character, Count Von Count. He's a parody of Bela Lugosi's Dracula. The Count's role in the show is to teach children counting skills. In his first appearance, he counted blocks with Bert and Ernie. Jim Nelson did the puppetry and voice from the original appearance until he died in 2012. Puppeteer Matt Vogel took over the role in 2012 and still voices the Count today. On November 12, 1972, one of the most disturbing and shameful experiments in American history ended. Tuskegee University is a historically black college in Tuskegee, Michigan. In 1932, 600 black men in the area were enrolled in the study. Many were impoverished and illiterate. The participants were told they were going to be treated for, quote, bad blood, unquote. The study was going to last 6 months. For the study, they would receive free medical exams. They would also get free rides to and from the clinics and be fed on those days. Their families would also receive a stipend when they died. What the men weren't told was that 399 of them were infected with a sexually transmitted disease, syphilis. The other 201 were a control group, and they were not given the disease. At the time, there was no proven method for treating syphilis. The study continued beyond the planned 6 months. 15 years later, in 1947, penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis. But none of the men were given penicillin for treatment. Instead, the study continued for decades. Researchers wanted to see the long-term effects of untreated syphilis in black men. In July 1972, the Associated Press broke the story of the study. The 40-year study was officially ended 3 months later, on November 12, 1972. 20 men died directly from untreated syphilis, and another 100 died from complications from syphilis. At least 40 spouses contracted it, and 19 children were born with the disease. Countless people were infected by syphilis, and the damage may never fully be understood. There was a class action suit, and in 1974, the U.S. government paid out $10 million, which in 2024 is $75.5 million, and the survivors and their families would receive free medical treatment. In July 1997, 25 years after the study ended, President Bill Clinton issued an apology on behalf of the U.S. government. He said, quote, "The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It is not only remembering that shameful past that we can make amends and repair our nation, but it is in remembering the past that we can build a better present and better future." Unquote. On November 25, 1972, the number one song was I Can See Clearly Now by Johnny Nash. The number one movie was the historical musical drama 1776. On November 25, 1972, Ethel Sokoloff was found strangled to death in her home in Los Angeles, California. About a year and a half later, on May 6, 1974, 81-year-old Ethel Grimes was found murdered in her apartment in Los Angeles. Grimes was the manager of the apartment building. It is believed she was killed by someone posing as a prospective tenant. She had been raped and strangled to death. 72-year-old May Scalise lived alone in a first-floor apartment in Los Angeles. On November 7, 1974, 6 months after the last murder, she was found raped and strangled in her home. It is believed that the killer got into her apartment through an unlocked bathroom window. The next day, the son of 92-year-old Lucy Grant found her dead in her home. It appears someone had forced their way into Grant's home and then raped and strangled her to death. A few items were stolen. A month later, on December 5, 1974, 74-year-old Ramona Gardner, who lived alone, was found strangled to death in her Los Angeles apartment. When her body was found, she had been dead for about a day. 4 months later, on March 22, 1975, 71-year-old Sylvia Vogel was found dead in the backseat of her car that was parked a block away from her home. It's believed she had been dead for 2 days. She had been raped and strangled. On April 7, 1975, a neighbor of 78-year-old Una Cartwright noticed her apartment door was open. They let themselves in and they found the dead body of Cartwright. She had been raped and strangled to death. On April 23, 1975, 75-year-old Olga Harper was found murdered in her apartment. Like the other 7 women, she had been raped and strangled. She may have been dead for 6 days before her body was found. Besides the murders, during that time frame, 21 older women who lived alone in the same area of Los Angeles were raped. The police believe that one man was responsible for all the rapes and murders. All the victims were white, older women, and the women who were murdered were all strangled. They all lived in a 20-mile radius in West Los Angeles. They all had a blanket or pillow covering their face. The police called him the Westside Rapist. We're just going to take a short break from this episode to bring you a word from our amazing sponsor, Pretty Litter. We all know cats are picky. I am too, especially when it comes to my cat. We've gone through a ton of cat litter over the years, and the best for us, by far, is Pretty Litter. Here's why. I believe that Pretty Litter saved my cat's life. Pretty Litter changes colors to indicate early signs of illness like urinary tract infections and kidney issues. We have been using Pretty Litter for some time, and we saw that my kitty had blood in his urine. We took him to the vet right away, and now he's fine. As long as we have cats, we're going to use Pretty Litter because it will give us peace of mind. We also like Pretty Litter because it's cleaner and more convenient than traditional litter. It's lightweight and low dust, and it's amazing at trapping odor and moisture. It's also easy to clean. A single pound bag works for up to a month. Plus, it ships right to my door. That means no more shopping and lugging home heavy bags or buckets of litter and then finding somewhere to store it. If you own a cat, you have to try Pretty Litter. It'll change what you think about kitty litter. Pretty Litter is amazing. You have to try it. Go to prettylitter.com/listed to save 20% on your first order and get a free cat toy. That's prettylitter.com/listed to save 20% on your first order and get a free cat toy. prettylitter.com/listed. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details. Thank you so much to Pretty Litter for sponsoring this episode. On May 23, 1975, 86-year-old Effie Martin was murdered in her apartment. The police immediately suspected she was another victim of the Westside Rapist. The day after Martin's body was found, a task force was formed to find the killer. At its peak, 17 detectives were on the task force. Unfortunately, the murders and rapes kept happening. On September 20th, 1975, the dead body of 79-year-old Cora Perry was found in her home by a neighbor. The police added her to the growing list of Westside Rapist victims. Over a month later, on October 28th, 1975, the killer struck again. 63-year-old Leila Shefsky was found dead in her triplex. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Her home had been ransacked, but it did not appear that anything was stolen. By this time, besides the murders, the police believed that the Westside Rapist had also committed 30 non-fatal rapes. On November 14, 1975, 67-year-old Lillian Kramer was found dead in her apartment by her landlord. She was last seen alive 2 days earlier. She had been strangled after she was sexually assaulted. On November 19, 1975, 73-year-old Annette Weingarten was raped and strangled in her home. In January 1976, the task force concluded there wasn't one Westside Rapist. Instead, there were 3, and those men had been arrested. In mid-December 1975, 22-year-old James Philip Richard was arrested for the murder of 73-year-old Annette Weingarten, which happened about a month earlier. The police did not think that Richard was involved in the other rapes and murders. They believed the other 2 men were probably responsible for those crimes. One was 25-year-old Gregory Smith, who was also arrested in mid-December 1975. He was arrested for burglary, and 3 living victims identified him as the rapist. The third man was 19-year-old Brandon Tholmer. Tholmer was arrested on December 30th while breaking into the home of an older woman. James Richard was convicted of the murder of Annette Weingarten in June 1977. It's unknown what he was sentenced to. Gregory Smith pleaded guilty to burglary and to raping a 50-year-old woman. No record could be found as to what sentence he received. Brandon Tholmer was sent to a psychiatric hospital. In early 1976, 67-year-old Elizabeth McCone lived alone in Los Angeles. She was a retired school secretary. She had worked for the Los Angeles Unified School District for 43 years. On February 15, 1976, she spent the afternoon with a friend. Then she went home to watch the Olympics on TV. The next day, her apartment was found ransacked and she was missing. McCone's body was found 3 days after she was last seen alive in the trunk of her car. She had been strangled to death. In the car, they found 2 different blood types. One belonged to McCone, and the police believed the second blood was the killer's. Since the police had 3 suspects in custody for the Westside Rapist case, they did not think that this murder was related to that case. On April 12, 1976, the dead body of 85-year-old Hazel Nichols was found in her Los Angeles apartment where she lived alone. She had been raped and strangled. There was speculation in the media that the Westside Rapist had committed the murder, but the police maintained that one man did not commit the murders and the 3 suspects were already in jail. For several years, there were no other similar murders in the area. This confirmed the police's belief that the 3 men, Gregory Smith, James Richard, and Brandon Tholmer, were responsible for the rapes and murders. Over 5 years later, on August 16, 1981, the son of 80-year-old Rose Letterman went to her home in Los Angeles to pick her up for dinner. When he got inside, he discovered that the house had been ransacked. His mother had been raped and strangled. On June 16, 1982, 57-year-old Janice Floyd was murdered, and then her house was set on fire. A cause of death was not made public. On August 19, 1982, 69-year-old Willamilla Woodcock was found raped, beaten, and strangled to death in her home. On February 27, 1983, 2 dead bodies were found in houses that were set on fire. 62-year-old Ruth Larson had been suffocated, but she was still alive when her house was set on fire. The burns contributed to her death. 72-year-old Jane Chasten was also murdered in her home, but the cause of death was not made public. On May 10, 1983, Lorraine Wells, age 76, was found smothered to death in her home. She had also been sexually assaulted. 11 hours later, the police were called to the home of 82-year-old Lucille Pyle. Her downstairs neighbor heard her screaming. The neighbor and his brother saw two men run from her apartment. They gave chase, but the men got away. Inside Pyle's apartment, the police found her dead body. She had been stabbed multiple times. In May 1983, a task force was started to investigate the murders. Unfortunately, no arrests were made in the months after the task force was created, but older women in Los Angeles continued to be murdered. On August 31st, 1983, firefighters were called to the home of 7-year-old Dorothy Fain because her house was on fire. The firefighters found her dead body in her home. She had been stabbed more than 70 times. On September 12, 1983, 72-year-old Mary Paquette was found dead in her house after it was set on fire. She had been beaten to death before her house was set on fire. In November 1983, the task force was reviewing possible suspects. One file they looked at was Brandon Tholmer, a suspect in the Westside Rapist case. After Tholmer was arrested in 1976, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. In 1979, he was transferred to a treatment center in Los Angeles. 3 months after he was transferred, about 2 years before the murders began, he became an outpatient. He just needed to check in once a month at the treatment center. An expert compared his fingerprint to one that was found at Mary Paquette's home. It was a match. On November 12, 1983, the task force started surveillance on Tholmer. 5 days later, they arrested him as he attempted to break into the home of an 85-year-old woman who had paraplegia. He was charged with the May 1983 murder of 82-year-old Lucille Pyle. A witness identified him as one of the men who ran from Pyle's apartment. The police searched Tholmer's home and they found over 200 pieces of stolen items like rings, watches, necklaces, and buttons. The police thought that Tholmer took these from his victims as souvenirs. The items were put on display, and the families of the murder victims came in to view the items. The family of 7-year-old Dorothy Fain, who was murdered in August 1983, identified a ring as belonging to her. A relative of 83-year-old Rose Letterman identified a jewelry box as hers. Letterman was murdered in August 1981. The police also matched Tholmer's shoe print to a print found at the 1982 murder of Willamilla Woodcock. In January 1984, the district attorney dropped the charges for the murder of Pyle. They did not believe they had strong enough evidence to take the case to court. Instead, Tholmer was charged with the murders of Mary Paquette, Rose Letterman, Willamilla Woodcock, Dorothy Fain, and Lorraine Wells. It's unclear what evidence they had against Tholmer in the murder of Wells. She was smothered to death in her home in May 1983. Brandon Tholmer's trial started in January 1986. There were over 100 witnesses and exhibits. The trial lasted 3 months and the jury deliberated for 8 days. Tholmer was found guilty of 4 of the 5 murders, the murders of Paquette, Letterman, Woodcock, and Fain. The jury was deadlocked when it came to the murder of Lorraine Wells. The judge declared a mistrial in Wells's case. In November 1983, Tholmer was sentenced to life in prison. Although Tholmer was only convicted of the 4 murders, the police are sure he had committed others. In particular, they think he killed Wells, even though the jury was deadlocked on her case, along with Lucille Pyle, Janice Floyd, Ruth Larson, and Jane Chasson. They also believed he was responsible for the Westside Rapist murders. So even though there were no murder convictions in the Westside Rapist case, the police believed that the killer was already in prison. In 2001, the LAPD started a cold case unit to investigate cold cases where they had DNA evidence. In 2002, one of the cases they looked at was Ethel Sokoloff. She was raped and strangled to death in November 1972. In the 1970s, her murder was not considered to be one of the Westside Rapist cases. It happened about a year and a half before the other murders. Experts were able to construct a DNA profile from the evidence on file. At the time, no match to the DNA was found. Then, in 2005, the police were alerted that a match to the DNA had been found. It was linked to another cold case, the February 1976 murder of 67-year-old Elizabeth McCone. The killer's blood had been found in her car. McCone was murdered after Brandon Tholmer and the other two men were arrested for the Westside Rapist case. So her case was not considered part of the series either. But still, no match to the DNA was found. Then we come to 2009. It had been 37 years since the first murder. A lot had changed in those years. In 1972, the three biggest movies were The Godfather, The Poseidon Adventure, and What's Up, Doc? In 2009, they were Avatar, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, and Ice Age: Dawn of the Dinosaurs. The biggest songs in 1972 were The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face by Roberta Flack, Alone Again Naturally by Gilbert O'Sullivan, and American Pie by Don McLean. In 2009, the three biggest singles were Boom Boom Pow by the Black Eyed Peas, Poker Face by Lady Gaga, and Just Dance by Lady Gaga featuring Kobe O'Donis. 1972 saw the television debuts of The Waltons, Sanford & Son, and The Price is Right. In 2009, Modern Family, Cake Boss, and Shark Tank all debuted. Ira Levin's The Stepford Wives, Judy Blume's Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, and Richard Adams' Watership Down were published in 1972. Popular books published in 2009 were One Day by David Nichols, Under the Dome by Stephen King, and Horns by Joe Hill, who is Stephen King's son. In March 2009, the police learned that a match to the DNA had been found. In the autumn of 2008, the Los Angeles Police Department was looking for a serial killer known as the Grim Sleeper. At the time, the police believed he had committed 12 murders between August 1984 and January 2007. Between 1984 and 1988, the police believed he killed 8 women and 1 man, and then between 2000 and 2007, he killed at least 3 women. Because of that 12-year gap in the murders, he got the nickname the Grim Sleeper. All the victims had been shot to death. The women, many of whom were sex workers, were also sexually assaulted. The LAPD had the Grim Sleeper's DNA profile. The police thought that the large gap in the killings was because the killer had been in prison. So the police came up with a list of 92 registered sex offenders whose DNA was not on file and fit the profile of the Grim Sleeper. One of those men was 72-year-old John Floyd Thomas Jr. Thomas worked as an insurance claim adjuster. In 1957, Thomas broke into a home in Los Angeles and got into bed with an older woman. The woman screamed, and then her son-in-law shot Thomas. Thomas was arrested at the hospital. The police also believe that Thomas committed a sexual assault and attempted sexual assault the prior month. Thomas made a plea deal and pleaded guilty to burglary. He was sentenced to 6 years of prison. In August 1978, Thomas was convicted of sexually assaulting a 78-year-old woman in Pasadena, California. He had beaten her and she suffered a broken ankle. A neighbor of the victim often wrote down license plates of strange cars parked near the apartment building. She wrote down Thomas's license plate. When Thomas's car was searched, the police found a ski mask. Thomas was convicted of rape and served 5 years of prison. He was released in 1983. In 1947, California initiated its sex offender registry. During the Westside Rapist investigation, The police looked at the registry for suspects, but Thomas was never considered a suspect because he was not a registered sex offender at the time. In 1957, he had only pleaded guilty to burglary and not any sex crimes. When he was arrested for rape in 1978, the police considered the Westside Rapist case closed. Thomas started working at the State Compensation Insurance Fund in Glendale, California in 1989. On October 22, 2008, Thomas came into the police station and gave a sample of his DNA. Months later, on March 21, 2009, after the police were alerted that his DNA was a match, Thomas was arrested. He was charged with the murders of Ethel Sokoloff and Elizabeth McCone. As the police investigated Thomas, they connected his DNA to two other sets of murders. The first started in March 1976, shortly after Tholmer and the other two men were arrested, and the murders in Los Angeles came to an end. All the victims lived in Inglewood, which is part of the Los Angeles metropolitan area. Mabel Hudson was a retired school teacher. On March 31, 1976, the 80-year-old returned home and walked into her garage in Inglewood. After Hudson entered the garage, a home invader attacked her in the garage. She was sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. About 2 months later, on June 14, 1976, shortly after midnight, a neighbor, 65-year-old Miriam McKinley, called the police. They heard strange noises coming from her apartment. They went to investigate and found the door to her apartment ajar. McKinley was nowhere to be found. Her body was found hours later in the backseat of her car, which was parked about a block from her home. She was another woman who was sexually assaulted and strangled. On October 29, 1976, the dead body of 56-year-old Evelyn Bunner was found in her car in Inglewood. She had been strangled and raped. Previously, the police had not connected the Inglewood murders to the other 14 in Los Angeles. The third set of murders that the police connected Thomas to happened after he got out of jail in Claremont, another city in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. All the attacks happened in a single square block. On August 21, 1983, 85-year-old Isabel Askew went missing from her apartment in Claremont. Her body was found 11 days later in a vineyard. It was decomposed, and the cause of death could not be determined, but the police labeled her death a homicide. 3 years later, in March 1986, an 83-year-old woman living on the same block was raped. A month later, a 78-year-old woman was sexually assaulted. Isabel Askew lived with her daughter, Adrienne Askew. On June 25, 1986, 56-year-old Adrienne Askew was found raped and strangled to death in the same apartment that her mother went missing from 3 years earlier. The police believe that Thomas murdered at least 3 other older women in Claremont during the 1980s. However, the police did not publicly reveal the other cases where he is the prime suspect. It appeared that Thomas stopped committing murders in 1987. That same year, he became a father and a husband. He also got a job in the mailroom at the State Compensation Insurance Fund. On September 10, 2009, in addition to the murders of Ethel Sokoloff and Elizabeth McCone, Thomas was charged with 5 more murders. They were the murders of Cora Perry in September 1975 in Los Angeles, the 3 Inglewood murders, Mabel Hudson in April 1976, Miriam McKinley in June 1976, and Evelyn Bunner in October 1976, and finally Adrienne Askew of Claremont, who was murdered in June 1986. Although Thomas was the suspect in the other cases we covered, he was not charged due to a lack of evidence. In the 7 cases where he was charged, the police had DNA evidence. In April 2011, 74-year-old John Floyd Thomas pleaded guilty to the 7 murders. He was sentenced to 7 life sentences, without a chance of parole. The police believe he may be responsible for as many as 30 murders, including the 19 we covered in this episode, which Brandon Tholmer did not commit. If Thomas did commit that many murders, it would make him the most prolific serial killer in Los Angeles history. At the time of this recording, 88-year-old John Floyd Thomas is serving his sentence at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, California. 74-year-old Brandon Tholmer is currently incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. In July 2010, the Grim Sleeper was identified. He was Lonnie David Franklin Jr. His DNA wasn't found in the suite for DNA from convicted sex offenders that led to Thomas's arrest. Instead, his son was arrested and a sample of his DNA was taken. The investigators were alerted of the familial match, and this led to his arrest. Although Franklin was the suspect in 17 murders committed between January 1984 and January 2007, he was only charged with 10 murders. His trial was delayed several times. In 2016, he was convicted of the 10 murders 6 years after he was arrested. He was sentenced to death. Lonnie Franklin died of natural causes in March 2020 at age 67. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Like we said in the opening, if you have any cases to suggest for Into the Killing, Criminally Listed, or Paranormally Listed, please visit our website, criminallylisted.com. Well, that's all for this week. Thank you again for listening. Please stay safe and take care of yourself.